And welcome to the NOLA Rundown. This is Will Osgood. Unfortunately, because of technical difficulties, right now we can only do one person on the show. And for the last few times, that's been me. We've tried to do a couple of using Skype and all those different things. A couple different guests or co-host shows with Jordan Grove. Hasn't worked out. But, and so we recorded them and I posted them, not realizing that it didn't work. So I'm not very good at the technological side. But anyway, that is not the point for now. I wanted to go ahead and talk the New Orleans Saints offseason plan. Obviously, we're right about that time when the combine, is coming up. Free agency follows shortly after that. Franchise tags, just all that stuff. It's the next month to 2 months, maybe even 3, because the draft doesn't happen till the end of April, are really kind of the big time in the NFL offseason. And so that is upon us. We can finally start to move on from the atrocity and the tragedy, if you want to call it that was the NFC Championship game. I've made my feelings known on that, and they're not much different from anyone else in Houdat Nation. But anyway, so I really I want this to be kind of a, not so much me nerding out on the X's and O's and advanced stats, which I've done a lot of lately, and will always be. That's who I am. But I want to bring some of those things in and talk about what I think what would make up for an ideal New Orleans Saints offseason. So there's kind of two big ideas, I think, that lead me to the conclusions that I've come to, at least as of Friday, February 22nd. February 22nd. I'm recording this right about 5 o'clock Central, 3 o'clock Pacific time, where I am right now. And so those big ideas really are this. Number one, it seems like the best teams in football, they're all kind of shaping their own distinct, unique identity. So for the Patriots, especially offensively speaking, so for the Patriots, this year they were a lot of 21 personnel, probably about 50% of their snaps, at least in the last month, and then into the playoffs and in the Super Bowl, were about probably 50%, 21 personnel, which is 2 running backs and a tight end, and then 2 receivers. That would be 21 personnel. Another probably 25% of the time they were, 2 tight ends with a running back and 2 receivers. And then about 25% of the time they were something else. The Rams, of course, they were the ones who most notably kind of started that trend of having a distinct identity personnel-wise. Playing, at least at one point in the year, they were at 97% of their offensive snaps from scrimmage. Playing 11 personnel, which is 3 receivers and a tight end and a running back. Then you had the Steelers, who, at least for a time, were running a lot of empty sets, using generally 11 personnel to do that, but they were in empty a lot, really spreading the field and doing some unique things that way. So they kind of had their identity as a team that was just going to spread it out and throw the football a lot of the time. And then you had, of course, Kansas City, who, with Patrick Mahomes, and they had started to do this a little bit with Alex Smith the year before, but running a lot of college spread schemes, spread concepts, both in the running and the passing game. And then you have the Saints, who obviously have been an explosive offense, have been one of the best offenses in the NFL since Sean Payton and Drew Brees came to New Orleans. And they've always been kind of this multiple offense, multiple personnel, multiple formations, using a lot of the same play concepts, just out of, a multitude of formations and personnel groupings. And I'm not suggesting that changed entirely, but I think I actually believe they can make one little simple change and kind of create their own distinct identity. And that could be enough to make up for the fact that they don't have a lot of salary cap room. And the second big idea that, in my opinion, the number one priority this offseason is to re-sign Teddy Bridgewater. And I'll get into that in just a second. But so I believe, and there is one, with keeping Teddy Bridgewater, which is going to cost some money. It's not going to be free. Obviously, it's going to cost probably close to the amount of cap space they have right now, if not more. And there's some pretty easy ways to create cap room. Certainly, you still have Cameron Meredith, who can be a tax or a cap cut, and you save, I think, about $3 to $4 million. Of course, you just saved $3 to $4 million on the Kurt Coleman deal. Yes, he still costs some money against the cap, but at least you save that money. So it'd be a similar situation with Meredith. There's some, end of the roster guy, and you feel terrible for them, and their salaries don't hurt the bottom line, but sometimes those are the easiest guys to cut to make room too, because they don't actually take up any dead cap space. And so there's some guys at the bottom of the roster that can be cut to help, create upwards close to $1 million each player in cap space. And so there are some ways to create some cap space that don't really hurt your team with the Bridgewater thing. And I'll talk about that, and then I'll get to the big solution that I've come to the conclusion. Oh, and there is one other thing I think the Saints can do to create more cap space, which would help re-sign Bridgewater, but then also take care of possibly some of the other, smaller needs, like replacing Sheldon Rankins for this year, which there's a few players out there, either, draft potential or free agents, although I would be hesitant to really jump into this free agent class until you get to kind of the second tier guys. But anyway, so with the Bridgewater thing, I think, and this can be tricky, but what I think you can do is I think you can kind of backload the contract, which is kind of an old approach, and it's a Mickey Loomis approach to handling contracts. Of course, a lot of teams nowadays are actually front-loading on contracts in order to make things work. But I think with Bridgewater, in order to make it work in terms of the cap and the roster, I think you can backload the contract. You can say, hey, look, both of us know Drew Brees is starting quarterback this year, but we have every desire to keep you. We want you to be our franchise quarterback in the future, which of course I believe he is. I believe he's, granted, nothing that's happened in his pro career has either proved or disproved that. To this point, it's kind of he's still a prospect in a lot of ways. But I absolutely believe he's a franchise quarterback. And that's, those guys don't grow on trees. I don't know that you're just going to be able to bring one in easily if you let him go. Now, of course, there's two potential issues with that. One is, okay, if you do that in such a way, and Brees' agent, Drew Brees' agent, I believe is Tom Condon. I believe that's who it is. Who it is doesn't really matter. He has a good agent, obviously, who knows what he's doing, who has a good relationship with the Saints. Has worked on multiple Brees contracts, but he would obviously have access to any contract that Bridgewater signs. He would be able to read the language and see it and figure it out pretty quickly. And does that, if Brees decides he wants to play again after this year, does that create an issue? Because then you would essentially be paying two guys starters money under my proposal. So that in and of itself obviously would be a huge issue that you have to work through, you have to be careful with. And and that is kind of risky. But I think it's a risk you have to take. And I mean, as much, and Drew Brees is my favorite athlete of all time, but he's, you could start to see some chinks in the armor at the end of this year. Even the deep pass that he completed to Ted Ginn that should have led to us going to the Super Bowl. It was underthrown, and it took everything he had to get it there, and it was still underthrown. So there are some potential issues. He's still a great quarterback, make no mistake about it. But I think Bridgewater's time is probably sooner rather than later. And I really think, this is probably, the window is closed. This upcoming season, 2019, is the last year Brees could legitimately probably capture his second Super Bowl. And so I say go for broke, which includes, though, also with an eye to the future, looking at keeping Bridgewater. Of course, the other obstacle to that is there are some other teams who are going to view Bridgewater as a franchise quarterback and give him the opportunity to start in 2019 and pay him like it. Now, of course, you have a bit of leverage. He's been in the building. By all accounts, his teammates love him. By all accounts, he loves his teammates. I don't know about his relationship with the city as much yet, but everything points to it being a good situation for him. I think he knows his best situation, his best career possibilities would be with the Saints, in the long term. And so you might have some leverage that way, as opposed to him going to, say, Washington or Jacksonville or any of the other potential free agent spots he could go. They all have their own issues and questions. Whereas New Orleans, you pretty much know what you're going to get. You have Alvin Kamara, you have Michael Thomas, you have a great offensive line, you have a defense that has been much improved the last 2 years, especially once you get past the first couple games. I think that that would be attractive if I was Teddy Bridgewater, but I'm not, obviously. So that's the big part of all of this is, what do you do with Bridgewater? I believe you sign him. I believe you sign him at more or less any cost. I don't think you can afford to not sign him. I think that's too important. And if that costs you $15 million even this year, I think you make it work. And that leads to, okay, so then what do you do? At that point, you cannot sign Mark Ingram. And I'm not even sure that you have to sign Mark Ingram, even though, if you start looking at some of the charting from SIS and, that Football Outsiders puts on, which suggests that, Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram are number 2 and number 3 in terms of, there was some stat I saw that they were the number 2 and 3 running backs this year. I want to say it was DVOA. And some of that, of course, has to do with the running, the offensive line and the way that they scheme up the running game, of course. And that's why I don't necessarily believe that you have to re-sign Ingram, because I believe you can, you can do that with Washington, right? Number 27. He had some good moments when he got to carry the ball. He looks like the kind of player who could be, an effective 5 to 10 carries a guy game. Kamara certainly is capable of carrying the ball 5 to 10 times a game. There's your 20 runs right there. You can continue to incorporate, Taysom Hill, getting a few runs, some jet sweep, reverse type stuff, and you can still get to your 20 to 25 runs a game, without, just completely giving the ball to one particular player, which I feel like to some extent is what Ingram requires.